If you're listening in January, chances are you've just come back from a bit of a break. Maybe you've been thinking about New Year's resolutions. Less scrolling, more exercise, or finally tackling the big life admin you've been putting off. For a lot of Australian families, especially those in regional areas, one of the biggest and most emotionally loaded pieces of unfinished business is succession. Who takes over the family farm? Who misses out? And what happens when those conversations are delayed for decades? Hello and welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This week on the show, we're talking about why farm succession has become one of the most fraught and consequential issues in Australian agriculture. What happens when the next generation doesn't agree? Bloomberg reporter Ben Westcott has been digging into this very issue, from soaring land values and tax complications to family disputes that can permanently fracture relationships. Ben, welcome back to the podcast and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you for having me and Happy New Year to you too.
Let's start now with the big picture here. Why is farm succession such a hot button issue right now? It's not exactly new, is it? But what has changed over the past decade that's making this harder and more urgent for farming families?
The simple answer really is land values. Since COVID, we've seen land values in all over Australia, but particularly in rural Australia, skyrocket. And that means that when it comes time to decide what you're going to do with the farm, the amount the farm is worth is much, much higher. Now, people have said to me, well, isn't that great? Doesn't that mean it make it easier to service the debt? But the big problem is when one sibling wants to continue on the farm and two others or three others don't. And they see the size, the value of that farm now that might be worth 10 million, 20 million and think that's my housing deposit, that's my whole house. When in reality, farms operate on a shoestring budget. They are worth 20 million, but they don't have $20 million just lying around and they're already leveraged up to the hilt in debt. So where does that money come from? How do the family find that without creating huge problems for the business itself? And that's when families start to tear at each other and the problems really start.
And you did a deep dive on this issue for Bloomberg Markets magazine recently, and for part of that you travelled out to the outback to really get to the heart of some of these issues. Ben, what struck me when I read your reporting was just how emotional this process can be. Why does succession so often become a flashpoint for resentment between family members, especially between those who stay on the farm and those who've gone?
Well, I think what this all comes down to is the fundamental difference between farmer successions versus other businesses. We've all seen, the TV show Succession. We've all seen, the Murdoch, the fraught Murdoch problems. But many businesses, when they have succession problems, it's not the family. It's, two people who really want the job, but who, are not at the end of the day going to be going to Christmas together. What makes farming so different is that so many of these businesses are family businesses, generational family businesses. And as everyone who's listening will have probably just returned from Christmas with their family, they know how fraught things can be when it comes to family. So add in money to that and add in lots of feelings about your future, what you want for your children, and that's when the problems kind of start.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier and look a little deeper at the numbers here, because I think it's really important to understand the size and significance of what we're talking about here. I mean, look, most of us aren't in line to inherit a million-acre cattle station. But,
sadly, yes.
Well, I speak for myself only, of course, but possibly more of us one day will have to think about how assets are divided when one of our family members passes away. Now, as you mentioned, Australian farmland has become incredibly valuable. How does that change the stakes when parents are trying to divide assets fairly, but not necessarily equally?
Well, I've spoken to a large number of families struggling with this exact question. And, one example that I was told was basically a farm that was worth, X amount of money. And then everyone had come to agreement after a very long period of time that one person would stay on the farm, the others would leave, and that they would be given a certain amount of money based on the value of the farm. That deal was reached in about, the late 2010s. Then COVID hit. The deal wasn't sort of resolved. And then we were in the 2020s. Land value doubled between 2015 and 2025 in rural areas. And so all of a sudden, there was another zero on the end of that equation. And all of a sudden, the family members said, well, hang on, I got this amount of money, now I want this amount of money, which from their perspective seems totally fair. But from the farmer's perspective, as a business, scaring up an extra, $1 million is absolutely something that is very difficult to do. Then there become all sorts of accusations. You're trying to cheat me out of my inheritance, or you're trying to ruin a generational family farm. You're trying to ruin dad's dream, mum's dream. That's when things get really heated, and you hear just families being torn apart.
So this is an emotional topic, primarily due to the fact that you're combining family and money for one, but also the nature of the business is also where these people are living, or at least some of these people are living too, which adds that extra layer of complexity to it. I'm sure that is something that, translates beyond people who are in line for a farming dynasty to the Rebecca Joneses and the Ben Westcotts of the world who are not. What lessons can you and I learn from the trials and tribulations of the farm succession issue here in Australia? I guess I'm thinking along the lines of what role tax issues play, capital gains, stamp duty, super, etc.
Well, I think it's actually much more simple than all of that. I think the one thing that is important when it comes to succession dramas like this, and the one thing we can learn from it, is a lack of communication, a lack of preparedness that leads to all these crises. And so the case study who we end up speaking to for this article, the Four Daughters family farm up in Queensland, they've been essentially engaging on a decade-long plan, and it's got many more decades to go, where they've been bringing their daughters in from a very young age. That their oldest daughter is only just about to turn 28, their youngest is still just over 20, but for decades now, they have been planning, if these four children wanted to continue the farm, they would know everything about the farm from the start. They would know how it works, how much debt there is, what the cash flow situation is like, so that they would not be taken by surprise. This has then led to the point now where all the daughters are on board. They all know exactly what they're getting into, and the family farm looks like it's going to survive into the next generation. At the same time, the Penfolds have also got enough land and are setting up the infrastructure that if the farm needs to split into four, or it's split into three with one bit sold off or two bits sold off, that's possible for them to do. It's this preparedness that really sets them apart from a lot of other families. The dad in the family, Dan, he was telling me about how he goes down to the pub with his mates and just says a little bit about what he's doing, and they'll just, out of nowhere, put their head in their hands and sigh and say, we've got some serious problems, we wish we'd done that. And we can all learn from that, really. We don't have to have a multi-million-dollar farming empire to know that if you let problems fester, and if you let them fester for a long time, you're going to be in trouble.
God, it's the tale as old as time, isn't it? And of course, you also, Ben, spoke to families where succession plans either collapsed or, they were never agreed to in the first place. What are the real-world consequences when this goes wrong? Not just financially for these families involved, but also for the community and the broader agricultural sector.
Yeah, I guess there's two different levels to this. And it is, on one level, it's heartbreaking because you just hear stories about grandparents who have not seen grandchildren at all, almost their entire lives, because the family has been torn apart by who owns what or who stuffed who over. You hear stories about court resolutions, about, families torn apart. And it is, terribly sad, particularly for families that have spent so much, these are people who live in each other's pockets, out on farms, far away from each other. So there's that respect, the personal angle to this. But then there's another much broader angle, which is that obviously in the past it's been somewhat taboo for farms to sell to big players, big business, big corporates. And we're seeing now a rise in the number of big players in the industry who are looking to come in and buy up agricultural businesses. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that these businesses in Australia are now so large because they've had to grow so rapidly due to the lack of subsidies that they are very much viable for the superannuation industry, for other private pension funds in other countries to come in. And the other reason is succession, because if there is a farm that is worth $14 million, for instance, and you have 3 kids who don't want to continue it on, then a great solution for the farmer is to sell their farm to a private player, to a pension fund or something like that. And then the farmer can give all his kids the money they're entitled to, and he can stay on the farm himself to continue running it for the pension fund, drawing a salary, setting up his own superannuation for retirement. In many ways, that is seen, particularly by the industry, as a win-win-win. The question then is that what farmers want? And I do talk to people in the industry who say that's not really farming. The family farm is a special thing and must be preserved. But it can't be preserved if the succession crisis keeps spiralling.
Right. And of course, we have done many podcasts exploring how big pension funds are getting creative about where they put their oodles of money. But if this is essentially a cultural driver for this reluctance to give up on the idea of a farmer-owned farm, let me understand, how bad exactly is this fail to plan to fail issue facing Australian farmers?
I have to say, since I started reporting on this story, I have been absolutely amazed by how often this comes up. At the National Farmers Federation conference in Queensland this year, every single session mentioned it in some way, and almost everyone you spoke to had a story, and some of them were very grim. The actual statistics are not very easy to find. There is a major study underway, but in one survey of dairy farmers in Western Victoria, they found just 14% of those people surveyed had finalised a succession plan. And another survey by Charles Sturt found that while they found slightly more had, about a quarter, some of them described it as 20 years of hell to get that succession plan sorted. So it's a nightmare for farmers, and many of them put it off, and you can kind of see why.
Crikey. Ben, it's January. People are thinking about fresh starts. If there is one lesson that you've taken from your reporting, what should farming families be doing now while everyone's healthy and business is stable?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to lecture our great farmers, but Karen, who leads the Penfold family, she says it herself that they have to get on it immediately. They have to start succession planning today, if not sooner, basically, because it will sneak up on you. The number of stories I heard of a farmer in his or her 70s or even 80s who didn't have a plan, who's now adult children, were desperate for an inheritance, desperate for some clarity about whether the farm they'd been working on for 20 or 30 years would be theirs, would be their siblings. That is a situation that no family wants to be in. Dan said it really well when I spoke to him, the farmer in charge of the Penfold family. He said that he's only going to be here for a smaller number of decades. His kids are going to be here for 50. And if they weren't talking, he would find that a huge blow to him. So I think start talking immediately is what they would say.
And that holds true for, families beyond farmers, right? It's one of those topics that sit at the intersection of money, identity and family. Is there any harder 3 elements to get right all at the one time?
Look, I'm sure I speak for many of our listeners when I say I just got through Christmas and I didn't want to be discussing millions of dollars with my family.
Lucky we don't have it. Ben, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Beck.
If you're listening and this struck a nerve, Ben's full story is out this weekend and dives deep into the human side of succession planning and why it may be one of the most important resolution Australian farming families can make in 2026. If you found today's conversation insightful, be sure to follow us wherever you listen and check for more reading on Australia's agriculture industry, including the latest reporting from Ben Westcott at Bloomberg.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. I'm Rebecca Jones. Thanks for listening.